Welcome to the Real Journeys of Success with Rob Elliott. Yes, again, we have an international guest. He's all the way from Singapore. And he's got an impressive list of who he is. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read him out. We call him the podcaster's podcaster. He's an entrepreneur. He's an author. He lives in Singapore. He's a founder of his own worldwide award-winning podcast agency. And he's not originally from Singapore. We are going to get into that before we get into some of his favourite things. Welcome to this show, Graham Brown. How are you, mate?
I'm all right. Thanks a lot, Rob. Really looking forward to this. I enjoyed the banter off air. Let's keep it going.
Mate, not a problem at all. Our listeners from all over the world love to hear the story of where people were. And if they're paying attention, that really isn't an accent that you find normally in Singapore. Where were you originally from?
Well, from England.
Yes.
So for my sins, I grew up in the motherland and got out when I was quite young.
Yeah.
So obviously, I think if you're ambitious, you want to go and see the world. A lot of Australians do, obviously.
Yeah.
So do the English. They want to go and see a bit of the world. And when I graduated, I went to Japan. So that started me on my journeys. Because this was the 90s, Rob, when Japan was a thing.
Yeah.
You know, it was Sony and TDK and Toshiba, all these big names back then. So I was very much, and since then I've been traveling non-stop, stopping a bit here and there.
So you must have been too bad at school if you actually got to go to university.
Well, I don't think you have to be that clever to go to university. I think it was just expected of everybody. My parents' generation didn't go to university. But so for them, they were very working class. My dad was a farmer. And my mom was the daughter of a shipbuilder from Glasgow. So that's very sort of traditional Glaswegian background.
Yeah.
And for them, like a lot of people, education was, escape. There was no other way to get out of poverty but to send your kids to university. So I was expected to go. If I hadn't gone to university, it's different now for my son's generation. But if I hadn't gone to university, I would have been a failure in their eyes.
So growing up where you grew up, do you think that made you more resilient and tougher for being in business?
That's an interesting question. I grew up in Portsmouth, which is a naval town.
Yeah.
My dad was a Marine, so they were stationed there. I think, really, how did that set me up for business? I didn't know anybody in business at that stage. If you had a look around my immediate network, and you read all these stories about entrepreneurs, how they were influenced by a dad or an uncle or a cousin who let them work in their hedge fund for the summer. For me, like all our network, my network, were plumbers, gas mechanics.
Yeah.
So there were no people who knew how to, they were entrepreneurs in their own right, but they weren't what we know as entrepreneurs these days. So I didn't have any kind of influence in that domain. So for me, where I learned entrepreneurship was through studying other people's stories. I became fascinated by books and audio stories about entrepreneurs. That for me was my mentoring, if you like.
So what did you study at university apart from drinking and getting dates?
Yeah, and I don't think I got an A in those either. So especially the last one. And so what did I officially study? I studied artificial intelligence.
Wow.
Which, in 1995 was a little bit ahead of the time. Yeah. You can be ahead of the time and then you can be too ahead of the time and it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
But as a computer guy and fascinated by psychology and behavior, for me, that was the most exciting thing ever. It was very different back then, obviously, to what we know as AI and machine learning today, just because of the computational power. But yeah, that's how I got my start.
Well, AI seems to be moving everywhere now. I was talking to a gentleman who funds the building of hotels the other day, and he said the new, what you call a 3-star hotel, you don't check in. You walk in with your iPhone or your Galaxy, scan it. It gives you your card. You walk upstairs. You don't talk to anybody. Everything is run by the computer. It's all artificial. You go to the lift, you scan it, it takes you to your floor. He said it's in many ways, it's a scary world we may be heading into. He said, but it's going to be up to the consumer where they come
It's transactional, isn't it? If you buy, you can go to a vending machine and buy food or buy chocolate bar or buy a bag of crisps. from a vending machine. And you can also go to a restaurant and get served by a celebrity chef. So I think you've got those two. You can buy the transactional experience, which is the 3-star you're talking about, which is going to be just driven by data and automation.
Yeah.
But if you want the experience, we were chatting about off air, about music, for example, people will still value that. And AI will never replace that. It may create the ability to do it better, for example, take away all the heavy lifting of doing it. But that will never go away. This will never go away. Chatting to people, human conversation.
At one stage, they thought movie actors would be put out of a job because they have the ability now to create somebody in a screen that looks real. But they soon worked out that the characters have no depth and people weren't reacting to them.
Well, think about art as an example. Technically, you've seen those videos and those studies of how they give a paintbrush to an elephant or a monkey and it can produce a Jackson Pollock style painting. But the point is, it's the story, isn't it? We buy Van Gogh, we buy Picasso because of the story of that person.
Yes.
Not necessarily the art itself. The art is, you hang it on a wall and you show it to somebody and then it's a story. Where did you find it? Where did it come from? Who painted this? So technically the art itself is not so important as the story behind it. And it's the same with music, isn't it? Like we like musicians because of their stories and our connection with them as opposed to the actual physical nature of the music.
Look, you're so right. Before we actually get into authenticity, storytelling, which was what we were discussing off camera and with leaders and how that's evolved from when you were, just for my listeners, how did you end up in Singapore and how did you end up owning and being a founder of one of the world's most awarded podcasting agencies?
Okay, it's a long story. Let me do the short version of it.
Short version,
yeah. So let's go back to 2012, Rob. I sold a telecoms business, a telecoms research business. It was focused on mobile telecoms and it kind of run its cycle. I'd done 12 years building that. And I hadn't, as you know, being an entrepreneur, taken a day off for many years. So I remember saying to my wife, look, I don't want to start another business. I really didn't feel the love at that stage. I was pretty much looking forward to just doing nothing for a while. So we said, what do we do? So we decided that we would declutter everything. So we sold everything that we had. And, I had a small family at the time. I had a 6-year-old boy. So you got all that rubbish that you build up over time. So we decluttered everything and then we packed our lives into 3 suitcases and then we went and traveled the world for 4 years. So, we lived on tropical islands, we lived the dream, I suppose, as people see it. But here's the interesting thing, Rob, is that actually, if you're an entrepreneur, lying on a tropical beach gets pretty old after some time because it's really interesting. You think these images you see on Instagram are going to make us happy, the sunsets in Fiji and living the dream in Okinawa, these places where we lived. But actually what I really missed as an entrepreneur was challenge, and I missed people. And I really missed that vibe, that hustle that you get with being an entrepreneur, the game, if you like. So after some years of doing that, and we spent a bit of time in Japan because my wife's Japanese. And we decided, look, at that time, I'd started a podcast and people were now coming to me and saying, how do I do this? How do I start a podcast? And somewhere in the back of my mind, I got this thought that I can make some money out of this. And then it started ticking and that thought grew and it grew. And there was this real challenge, which was, I was in my 40s at the time. So I wasn't a young entrepreneur. And I had, was quite comfortable. And there was this idea that I could take on this massive risk, which was to take my family from Japan, because my son was in school there, move to Singapore, start a podcast business where nobody had known about podcasting in 2018. It was really ahead of the curve. Start a business which didn't have any obvious market there at that time because it was still 3 or 4 years away, and really just grow something from scratch. And on the face of it, it looks insanity, but something in there enticed me to do it. And I think that, if you go back to we as entrepreneurs, what do we do? Why do we do it? And what makes us happy? That's it. It's hard to explain to somebody who's not from that world.
Yeah.
But that idea of the reward isn't exiting and, putting your feet up and, riding your days out into the sunset.
No,
The
not at all.
reward, I think, of being an entrepreneur is keeping playing the game. That's what keeps us alive. That's what keeps us thriving. So it's a long answer.
Yeah.
But that's why we're in Singapore now.
So you're in Singapore, you're looking back now, and when I teach people sales and I talk to them about how they should sell, I talk to them about how stories are the easiest way to sell who you are or what your product is. And stories make you, or in your customer's eyes, more authentic. How did you do it then when people didn't really know about podcasting? You needed customers. You had to get out, you had to pay the bills. How do you start and build those stories around something that people really don't understand?
That's interesting. At the early stage, there's always a story in everybody's situation. Like this podcast, I like how you describe it, that ordinary people have potentially extraordinary stories inside them. Everybody's got something.
Yeah.
And that is often the case, but people don't realize it. That your listeners, they may feel that, I don't have a story worth telling. But that you do, you really do. Everybody's overcome something. Everybody's left a bank to work in a startup or left the country to go and start a new business or taking on something, on some challenge, left your comfort zone. So people resonate with that. And that for us, when we moved to Singapore and set up the business, that was the first step in the story, which was, we've come here to take on a challenge. This is our vision. You sell the promised land to people, which is, this is what we want to build. We want to build this agency to help people tell stories, to help brands humanize their communications, etc. So some people buy into that. Yeah.
So how tough was it then compared to now?
Very. People would say, I don't have 5 minutes to listen to a podcast. So the market wasn't ready. There's a great book by Peter Thiel called 0 to 1. Peter Thiel was Elon Musk's erstwhile partner at PayPal, and he said that be careful of educating a market, because that you could take a lifetime and billions of dollars. And in hindsight, that's where I was. I was educating a market, and the market was Asia, so it's very large.
Yeah.
So back then, you faced a lot of resistance. Why podcasts? I don't understand it. But, the market's been selling itself in the last 2 years at least. Yeah. But back then it was, you had to be stupid or thick-skinned or maybe genius, a mix of all, to really pull that off, because you were just facing a lot of rejection at the time. People didn't get it because it was not only, Singapore was very corporate. There's a lot of
that's true.
HQs here, but also it was Asia. So it was like 3 or 4 years behind the US. Yeah. And it was always, that's what they do in the US. We don't do that here, which was another thing which you faced resistance on. So it was very tough, but that makes you tougher, I guess. That creates you.
So post-COVID now, you've looked back, how does a leader now, 2021 and above, build authenticity through storytelling when there's so many stories out there now? There's so much information on the net. People basically research the product before they come to you. How do they do it now?
Yeah, people follow people, not brands. That's the reality today. If you were to look, for example, let's say LinkedIn is probably one of the most effective channels if you're in business.
Yeah.
Especially if you're business to business, for example.
Yeah.
So it's a great channel. And if you look there, for example, let's take Microsoft, for example. So they part-own LinkedIn. So, they should be using it. If you look at the Microsoft official page on LinkedIn, and I'm sure listeners can go and have a look at this, their posts are getting, I'm not joking, between 2 and 5 likes. And they've got 12 plus million followers. How does that make sense that you can get so few likes? Even my worst posts on LinkedIn do better than Microsoft's, and they have millions of followers. And yet you've got somebody like Satya Nadella the CEO, he'll post something quite authentic, which isn't very corporate-y, isn't plastic, it isn't polished, and it will get thousands of likes. And that really tells us a lot, that the reality is that how we experience brands today is people. Your persona, your story, your way of communicating with people individually becomes how I, as the audience or the buyer, experience that brand.
Yeah.
So brands have to realize that. I think they're slowly learning that this idea of this monolithic brand narrative, the agency concocts this big idea. In the old days, it would be like Tony the Tiger or some mascot, and then everybody goes out and buys it. But now it's not about that. Now it's not about fake. Now it's about, who are you? What's your story? And why should I listen to you? And that really is not just a challenge for brands, because they have to let go a little bit.
They do.
But it's also a challenge for the leaders, because they have to be vulnerable. They have to do things like this, Rob. They have to sit and talk without knowing what the questions are going to be, and trust that person that they're going to do a good job of it.
Yeah. But that's part of the fun, isn't it?
But if you're a corporate, it can be a little bit scary, where if you're over a certain level, so the corporations that I'm talking about are the blue chips and the investment banks and so on. You did everything with a handler.
Yes.
You had, you can't ask Mr. Elliott that question. Let me see Mr. Elliott's questions. It's always Mr. this, Mr. that. And they want to see it. They get in the way, and they'll polish everything down, and there's no surprises. And it's scripted and it's boring. But that's the problem, isn't it? That's kind of how we've been doing it for 50 years, and we've got to change that.
Look, I remember when I was first in sales, and I got on very well with this lady who owned 5 liquor stores, and she was old school Italian, and she was as straight as it came. If she didn't like you or didn't like what you're offering, she just told you. But she was very loyal. And so I remember we used to give what we call rebate checks, and my boss was stuffing her around with the rebate check and wouldn't pay her what she wanted, the whole thing. And he came out one day, she looked at him, looked at me, and said, "You leave. I deal with Robert." That's exactly how she said it. And he just looked at me and he left, and she said, "Robert, I trust you. I buy because of you. I don't buy because of him. He's not allowed in my shops." Authenticity. He was fake.
Yeah.
He didn't know how to speak to people. And
how
he
true
was
that
never
is in
going to be a
sales
leader.
as well, right? That people buy you first, then the product.
They do. They do. I hear a lot of people talking about brands now and how they can build authenticity. You speak to a lot of people. You've done thousands of podcasts, both behind as guest and as host. If someone came to you and said, "I'm about to launch this big brand in Singapore," it meets the need of what the people have said they want. How does a brand today build authenticity when they're brand new?
So let's define what authenticity really means, because it's kind of the word du jour, isn't it? It's getting pulled and changed beyond its original meaning.
It is.
But if you look, in ancient in Greek, it means just original. And interestingly, if you go to ancient Greek, the word authenticity shares the same etymological root as audio, interestingly.
Really?
Audience, audio, audience, and authority all come from the same etymological root. And it doesn't have a direct translation, but in ancient Greek, there's a word that begins with AU. Yeah. I'm sure if you've got any ancient classic scholars listening, they can pull me up on this. But it basically means to feel. Right. It means to perceive or to feel. In the same way you can think about that with audience and authority. You feel it. And you feel, like with audio as well, when you're listening, you feel that person more than when you see them in many ways, right? And it's real, it's in your ear. And it's like with your, for example, with my wife, when she's saying to me, if she's, annoyed with me, she would say to me, like, "You're not listening." She would never say, like, "You're not looking at me." Think about that in our language. That's how powerful audio. The
My wife
AU,
says the same thing, man.
you're not listening.
Yeah.
Something about man, I'm afraid. So
Yes.
that's just how we do. And it's that power of relationships. So it's about relationships and it's about feeling. So when you ask me, how does a brand do it?
Yeah.
Well, who do we have relationships with and who do we really trust? It's people.
Yeah.
So like now, if people want to buy a brand, they want to buy the people. So who is that person? Who are the people of this brand? Think about, for example, the world's most valuable automotive brand today. You immediately know who the founder is, right?
Yeah.
So think about that. And Toyota have been grinding years in the background
Yes.
at number one position. And along comes a single individual and changes that. And it's the same with Apple, for example. We all know who the founder was. So I want to know, as audience and as a consumer, what is the origin story of this brand? Who are they?
Yeah.
Why are they here? Who is this person? I want to know the individuals and the humans inside. And so the challenge now for the comms and the marketing people of that brand is to unlock that human potential. Give those people a platform to talk. Give them the tools to tell their story. Don't gatekeep that flow of information, which is traditionally what happened. Like, become an enabler. Give them the megaphone to go out there. Give them guidelines and green lights to go and tell their story in a very authentic way. That's what brand leadership is today. Few brands are doing it, but we see some great brands doing it. You know, people like, I think, Tony Fernandez from AirAsia is a great example. I mean, who cares about airlines? Nobody. But people care about him because of his, okay, he doesn't get it always right. But those guys get a lot of forgiveness, right? Because people buy into their story. So I think, look at those examples. Look at how people are out there in a very vulnerable way telling their story.
Yeah, look, I think you're right. I heard chatting to a guy the other day. He was talking to about us. They've got a new general manager, and within 2 months, the people working for this guy, he doesn't own the company, picked him up as fake, to use his words. So he said to me, "How does a leader like the blue chips, the big end of town, they do move around every 2 to 3 years? They have a short period of time to build trust with the people working with them. They can do it two ways. They can do a management by fear, which is the old school. I'm the boss, take it or leave it. Or they can be your leader. So one's a manager in my books, one's a leader. If one of these guys came to you and one of the big, and I mean, Singapore's known for its telecommunication companies and its high tech, and they said, I'm about to take over a new job. We've got 2,000 or 3,000 employees. I'm contracted for 4 years, but I really need to hit the ground running and build that trust. What would you say to them now would be the best way for them to get out and build the trust and build authenticity with the people working for the company?
So this is a real situation. This happens a lot.
Yes, it does.
That the key here is owning their own voice, because one of the challenges any leader, and I like your definition, leader versus manager.
Yeah.
A leader really is out there and staking a flag in the ground for people to rally round. Really, that's what they do. They're not necessarily the CEO every time, right?
No.
So they could be anybody within the organization. But the key for them is to own their voice, own their story. And if they were to go to the media, of course, they can get their words out there, but maybe they are at the mercy of the scheduling or the agenda which the media is trying to bend the narrative into. What we really need to do is help that leader create their own media, create their own, media empire. And you can easily do this for cheap today, like starting a podcast.
Yeah.
So that's a great starting point, because you will attract your followers. You create a home for your podcast.
Yep.
For your followers, your tribe, if you like. And they may cut across different divisions, different departments. They might not be the ones with C in their title. They might not be the heads, but you might have somebody who might be an IT manager or a developer who really believes in you and your vision, but you haven't got a home for that conversation with them. So a great starting point is creating owned media, which is a podcast of sorts, because I choose podcasts like yourself because it's a very agile way to do it.
Yeah.
You don't need a production crew of TV and lights, and you don't need 20 different takes, and people are
No.
cool with that.
Yeah.
And you can sit and meet other people. And I'm here talking to Rob.
Yeah.
And Rob's talking to Graham. And, you know, those are the meetings that we can create and conversations in this podcast. So that's a great starting point, I think, for any leader to own their own voice.
Yeah. I watched a podcast the other day from a major company, and it was a new senior executive. And it was a great idea. They put it apparently up on their internal website. Now, I know what he was trying to do, and he had one of the other managers interviewing him, but it was awful. The intent was good, but it was scripted. It was staged. I looked at it and I went, why didn't these guys employ someone to come in who knows how to interview, who knows how to do a podcast that you can put up on the internal website and make it a little bit more authentic than this horrible, clunky, you already know what you're about to ask. And I think it did more damage than good. Do you think a lot of them, they have the right idea, but they just don't go to the right professionals to do it?
They don't know what's possible. That's what I feel.
No.
And that's one of the problems. They start from a default position of what they've always done. So this, for them, is PR.
Yes.
So they'll treat it like PR and a press release, effectively. So it's scripted and it's efficient as opposed to effective, which is a big difference in communication, right? There's no like mistakes. There's no ums and ahs. So that's the challenge. And I think back, I mean, my sales days, selling was my origin myth in business. That's how I got started. And my first ever business is, and going back to the story about I didn't know anybody. I started a website design business in the late 90s because that's all I knew to do. Like I knew that older people didn't know how to do it. I could kind of do it. And so therefore I could sell it. And it's interesting, Rob, I remember going to one company.
Yeah.
It was really door knocking stuff in those days.
Oh, literally. I've done that. Hard yakka.
The only way to learn, like kids these days would never understand what it was like to beat the path up to a client.
Carry
doing
the bag,
all that
as we
stuff.
called it.
Yeah, like the man from the Prudential, doing all that stuff. So I remember going to one client and selling the idea of a website. This is 1998, so we're talking Netscape Navigator, AOL Online, all that stuff.
Yeah.
And they said, okay, we like the idea, but this is what we want you to do is, here's our brochure. And it was like a trade plumbing center. So you can imagine, like, you've got this thick brochure of all the different items in there, you know, hundreds of pages. Said, like, what I want you to do is scan that brochure and upload it to the website. I'm like, wait a minute, you want me to, because even a scanner back then was radical technology. You want to take this like printed brochure, scan every page and upload it to a website? I said, yeah, we'll pay you to do that. And I was telling a friend about it and he said, yeah, you can package this and sell it as brochureware. And there were agencies agencies out there selling brochureware, and people were buying it and paying thousands of dollars.
Oh no.
Because they didn't know. All they saw the new medium as was the old medium, but in new clothes, if you like. So it was new media, but business as usual. They were just scanning print, putting it online. So back to the story about that podcast, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
It's taking the old way of doing things and bringing it into digital. So it's digitization, right? Which is basically turning it into digital, which doesn't change it in any way. So it's brochureware.
Yeah.
Whereas what they need to do is a new mindset, like with the internet back then. It wasn't about simply reformatting it on a more efficient distribution channel. It was about thinking about it in a different way. And for us, it's about, you know, what we're talking about here is like being authentic.
Yeah.
And it's not just about turning it to digital, but it's about, you know, unlocking, you know, the vulnerability and the human beings inside these organizations, right? That's what it's about. So that's really a new paradigm.
Fear of not being in control that stops a lot of these guys.
Yeah. Maybe the thing is, Rob, I don't think it's so much these guys. I think it's the people around them. That I mean, if you go to like a comm, so traditional communications, reputation, you know, like PR type event, when they had events back in the day before COVID. It would all be about, your executive tweets about China. What do you do now? It was all about crisis management.
Yes.
It was all about control. It was all about efficiency. If you imagine traditional communications in a corporation was organized like a pipeline, like an oil pipeline. And if you own a pipeline, the one thing you want to make sure with that pipeline is it doesn't leak. It's all about 100% efficiency.
True.
And that is how we used to control communication in corporations back then. Now we need platforms, which is, okay, I'm an enabler. Here is a tool, go out and talk, but do it within these guidelines. So here's the safe zone, which you can talk about, right? I can't police it all. I can't control it all. But I know if the right training, you can go out there and do good. That's the different mindset. So from pipeline to platform in these organizations and from control to curation effectively.
Yeah.
But I wonder, you may need a different person to do that, because if you've been trained 30 years in comms, maybe that's all you know.
Well, someone said to me, anyone doing marketing now at university, if the book's more than 2 years old, you're wasting your time, because COVID has totally thrown everything everyone's ever been taught out the window, and everything's changed. When you're talking before about control, I must tip my hat off to the guys who ran Barack Obama's first campaign, because they were the first ones to harness Twitter. And the press in America hated it because they were twittering their policy announcement at the same time as the press release was hitting the paper. And so the press then lost control of the narrative. And we all know how press do like to control what's going out there. And they all lost control. They didn't know what to do. But he built authenticity with the voters by doing that, because they could Twitter him back. That had never been done before.
No, that's a great example. And it really requires, it's a risk.
Yes, it was.
But it always, it's a calculated risk that this is, do you believe that this is the macro trend that is changing the way we communicate? And therefore we need, the challenge, I think, Rob, is having people who aren't brochure people to really understand it, because they, the problem with being successful in any domain is the more successful you become, the harder it is to change the rules which have made you successful, right? So if you're 30 years in marketing, it's going to be really hard for you to suddenly come out of that and unlearn and become, on the same playing field as the guy who's just come out of university.
Mate, so true. When you're sitting back now and you've seen a lot of change in the industry, and you've seen podcasting evolving, you've seen all these new mediums, do you think that AI will take over a lot of this? Or what do you see as the biggest step change that's coming probably in the next 3 or 4 years that business and leaders should be aware of?
Yeah, AI is definitely having an impact already. And in many ways at this below the surface, if you consider every delivery app now has some form of AI.
True.
Calculating. It's like the old salesman problem, you remember? How do I go from A to B to C in the optimum time? So that's happening now. And it's not, what we may call AI. It's more machine learning, but it is a form of AI. Yeah. And really it's just, effectively identifying patterns and manipulating spreadsheet data better than human beings could ever do. So that's happening. And where I think the really interesting area of where it's having its biggest impact is probably the least anticipated, meaning that everybody expects AI to wipe out the unskilled labor force, right? It's going to be the agricultural workers, it's going to be the factory workers replaced by robots.
They said the same about computers.
Well, yeah, exactly. But here, that's always the fear with these disruptive changes, that the low-skilled, uneducated, low-educated workforce is going to get wiped out. However, the reality is they are the most resilient. If you work at 7-Eleven and you lose your job, Monday morning you've picked something else, you're working somewhere else.
True.
You're not a lawyer or an accountant who suddenly had 10 years of education wiped out.
Yeah.
where the interesting change is, it's doctors, accountants, lawyers. It's the highly skilled, highly educated elite within society who are biggest, who are most under threat from AI. And I tell you why, is you take just one example, doctors. Now, if you're a consultant surgeon or a consultant in a hospital, you spend, you sign up as a doctor, you take the Hippocratic Oath, to serve mankind and ethics, etc. Right? That's what you believe in. You want to serve.
Yeah.
However, if you look at the data, like doctors spend 80% of their time in paperwork, and that is for
That's
regulatory reasons. Yeah, it's not what they signed up for, but that is the reality. Whether it's like writing prescriptions or like writing up a surgery or whatever it may be. And the time that they do have left, a vast percentage of that is actually looking at patterns. So, for example, if you're a surgeon, like you're probably spending a lot of your time looking at scans. You're looking at diagnostic scans. Looking at, for example, cancer scans. Does this patient have cancer or not?
Yes.
And interestingly, that is a vast percentage of what they do. However, everybody says, oh, the doctors, they're very highly skilled. You can't replace them with a robot. But a robot is far more effective at doing that than a doctor. It can do it much faster, doesn't sleep, and doesn't require a salary. So that raises a very interesting question about, okay, so if I'm a doctor, what do I now do? Well, here's the challenge. It goes back to what you started. What a machine can't do. I mean, I can't, let's say you're in hospital, Rob. If I was a doctor and I got a robot on the case, I'm going to scan you, look at your case history, match you with patterns in like split second, done. I found what the analysis is. But what the robot can't do is sit by your bedside and hold your hand and say, Rob, you okay? How you doing? True. It can't do that with any kind of meaning. And therefore, if you are a doctor, if you are an accountant, a lawyer, salesperson, whatever it may be, that is where the value is shifting, just like it did in every industrial revolution. It wipes out one class of people and creates another. And this is what we're undergoing now. And we're right in the middle of it. And so nobody's giving it a name. Nobody's saying, oh, look at all these things happening around us. But it's here. And in time, they'll look back and say, yeah, that was the fourth industrial revolution. That's when it all happened. But when you're in the middle of it, you're just an actor, just seeing random, uncorrelated events unfold, right?
True, mate, true. I've got a couple of quick questions to wind you up with. If you're back in the motherland and you come across your 20-year-old self, what would you tell him?
Is that why you're winding me up? Is you literally back in the motherland?
No. It's I always people always they look at that one, and some of the people have said to me they love that question because it shows how our guests are thinking.
Yeah,
what are you going to tell yourself?
You don't have a lot of time.
Make the most of it.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Like if you're on, like you really, when you're 20, you have all the time in the world. And like when you're much older, it just seems to go faster. I mean, I can remember being 20 just like it was yesterday. I can remember being in a pub with my mates talking about what we're doing in the future. And I don't feel any different as a person yet.
No.
For me, 30 years have passed. So it's incredible, really, like in the blink of an eye. And I think, wow, in another 30 years, I'll be 80. So I might not even be here statistically.
Mate, who knows? Who knows?
Exactly. Yeah, I think time is what you learn, isn't it? Especially if you've experienced anybody close to you losing somebody.
Yes.
That really impacts you, and you really start to ask questions about everything, career, success. We need these reminders. Otherwise, we could just waste a whole life.
Oh, I couldn't agree more. This is a new one, so I'm going to throw it at you. If they turn around and the big fella upstairs has said, your time's up, you can choose one last drink. Doesn't have to be alcoholic. It can be, doesn't matter. What would be your last drink of choice before you got on the escalator up?
Oh, I've never considered that one. I don't know. Like, why a drink? It doesn't have any magical properties. It's not like I can get 3 wishes out of it.
No.
I don't know. I'm not. It would probably be. I've got no idea. Coffee, tea.
That's cool.
A beer. It's like, I think with these things, if it's with somebody,
Yes.
it's different, isn't it? Like all these, I mean, you can drink coffee or tea on your own, but sitting with somebody and chatting,
Yeah.
is different.
I've learned some of my biggest lessons with some of my customers sitting having a coffee with them outside of business, but about business.
Yeah, that's magical though. I think that's where it's about, I mean, I lived some time in Spain. I think I learned a lot about that they would just sit and have a coffee and just talk. No, nobody, one thing I noticed, Rob, like nobody in Spain walks with a coffee like they do in other countries. They do,
that's true.
They walk with it in their hand. They just don't, it doesn't happen. It's not allowed. Culturally, when you have a coffee, you sit and you talk about anything. And I love that. And I think that's something missing in our life. There's actually a beautiful word in Spanish, which my Spanish is a bit rusty now, but it means sobremesa, which means between tables, which basically means that after the coffee, after your lunch, there's just like this time of nothing. Not siesta, but just to relax and chat with friends and coffee.
Mate,
and I think we all need a bit of that.
That's an awesome way to finish the main part of the podcast up today. How do people find out a little bit more about you, contact you, or they're interested in your podcasting agency? Where do they find you?
If you go to my website, my personal website, Graham D. Brown. So it's Graham with an H, grahamdbrown.com. So you see everything there about my agency and the books and so on.
Fantastic, mate. It's been a complete pleasure. It really has chatting to you today. We'll catch up again in another 6 or 7 months and see where the world has gone. You're living in a beautiful part of the world in Singapore. I haven't heard anyone that's been there said a bad word about the place. So you are blessed where you are.
Thank you.
And I hope your wife keeps you in line.
I'll give you an update in 6 months.
Well, they'll know that she's let you live that long at least. Mate, thank you again so much. And as we say to everybody on our podcast, have a groovy day.
Thank you.